A Viking could survive a battle, survive a raid, even survive an axe coming straight at him. But on a freezing night in the North Atlantic, something much quieter could kill him. The first thing you need to understand is that a Viking longship was basically a wooden platform sitting on top of freezing water. No heated cabin, no cozy bedroom, no dry room where you could escape while the storm passed. And if you want more stories about how ancient people actually survived the stuff we take for granted today, stick around, because this one gets way crazier. Because here's the part most Viking stories leave out. If the weather turned bad, you were outside in it. Cold wind hit you. Rain hit you. Sea spray hit you. And if things went really wrong, the freezing ocean was only a few feet away. So how did these people cross some of the coldest waters in the world without modern jackets, heaters, or emergency rescue? And before we get into it, if you like the kind of history that makes you look at ordinary things completely differently, stick around, because by the end, you'll realize the Vikings weren't surviving the cold the way you probably think they were. The first thing they had to control was heat loss. Your body is constantly producing heat, but the environment is constantly trying to take it away. And on an open Viking ship, the environment had a huge advantage. Wind moves heat away from your body. Cold water pulls heat away even faster. And once your clothes get wet, the situation gets worse. So the Vikings didn't try to make the ship warm. They tried to make the person harder to cool down. One of their most important tools was something incredibly simple: wool. Wool fibers trap tiny pockets of air, and that trapped air helps slow the movement of heat away from your body. But wool wasn't some magical Viking cheat code. If it became completely soaked, it could become heavy and lose much of its insulating ability. So the goal wasn't to stay perfectly dry. On a ship like this, that was almost impossible. The goal was to slow down the cold and buy yourself more time. That's why layers mattered. You could add insulation when you were sitting still. You could open a layer when you were working hard. You could protect an outer garment from wind and spray. But there was a nasty problem hiding inside this system. Working could make you too hot. Imagine rowing for a long stretch. Your muscles are working constantly. You're burning energy. You're producing heat. You start sweating. For a few minutes, the cold might barely bother you. Then your shift ends. You stop moving. And suddenly, you realize your clothes are damp. The wind hits them, and all that heat your body just created starts disappearing. Fast. So the Vikings weren't simply fighting cold. They were managing a constant battle between overheating and freezing. Work too hard, and you sweat. Work too much, and you sweat. Stop moving, and that moisture can become a problem. Survival meant knowing when to add protection and when to let your body cool down. And then there were the parts of your body you absolutely needed to keep working: your hands and feet. When you're cold, your body starts protecting your core. It can reduce blood flow to your extremities because keeping your vital organs warm matters more than keeping your fingers comfortable. But on a Viking ship, your hands weren't optional. You needed them to pull oars, handle ropes, steer, climb, balance, and hold equipment. If your fingers became numb, you weren't just uncomfortable. You were becoming less capable of helping the crew. That's why things like mittens, socks, foot wrappings, hoods, and proper footwear mattered. And unlike today, there was no store waiting at the next port. If your shoes got soaked or damaged, you couldn't just replace them with a new pair. What you carried with you was what you had. A dry pair of foot wrappings could be just as valuable as another piece of equipment. And this leads to one of the biggest survival rules on the ship: protect the dry stuff. A dry blanket might sound like comfort to us. On a freezing voyage, it could be insulation. Because eventually, you're going to stop rowing. You're going to rest. You're going to sleep. And that's when the problem gets worse. While you're working, your muscles are generating heat. While you're sleeping, they're not. You're lying still, your clothes may still be damp, and cold air is still moving around you. So suddenly, that dry blanket becomes incredibly important. Keeping bedding and spare clothing dry wasn't housekeeping. It was survival planning. Somebody had to protect the dry gear. Somebody had to manage the food. Somebody had to watch the weather. Somebody had to handle the ropes. Somebody had to bail water. The ship stayed alive because everyone did a small job. And that reveals something important about Viking toughness. The strongest person on the ship wasn't necessarily the most valuable. A person who understood how to keep the entire system working could be far more important than the biggest warrior on board. Because the crew itself was part of the survival system. When people are packed together, their bodies produce heat. They can block some wind. They can help one another with equipment. They can take turns working and resting. But even that creates another problem. More people means more sweat, more breath, more moisture, and less personal space. So once again, the solution creates another problem. Well, helps, but it can get soaked. Rowing creates heat, but makes you sweat. Crowding helps with warmth, but increases moisture. Dry blankets help you sleep, but only if they stay dry. Nothing was perfect. They were just stacking small advantages. Then the weather changes. A storm hits, and suddenly nobody cares about being comfortable. The sail needs handling. Ropes need pulling. The ship needs steering. Water might be coming over the side. Someone has to bail it out. Someone has to keep watch. And now you've got exhausted people working while cold rain and wind are hitting them from every direction. This is where the idea of simply wearing more clothes falls apart. If you wear too much while working, you sweat. If you wear too little, you lose heat. So the crew has to constantly adjust. Open the cloak. Close it. Remove a layer. Put it back. Work. Rest. Eat. Dry what you can. Protect the spare clothes. Keep going. But there was one danger that could make all of that almost useless. Freezing seawater. If somebody went overboard, the entire survival equation changed in seconds. Cold air is dangerous, but cold water can pull heat away from the body extremely quickly. Now imagine being thrown into dark, freezing water while the ship is moving. Your clothes become heavy. Your hands start losing sensation. Waves can separate you from the ship. Panic burns energy. And there isn't a rescue helicopter coming. There isn't an emergency beacon transmitting your location. There isn't an insulated survival suit waiting on the deck. The crew has seconds to react. That's why staying on the ship wasn't just common sense. It was survival. And it also explains why getting to land mattered so much. A Viking ship's shallow design allowed it to reach and land on beaches and access places larger ships couldn't. Once the crew reached shore, the entire situation changed. Suddenly, they could build a fire. They could dry clothing. They could repair equipment. They could cook. They could rest somewhere that wasn't constantly moving underneath them. Land wasn't just the destination. Land was part of the survival strategy. We know about the Viking voyages that succeeded because those are the stories that survived. We know about the crews that reached new lands. We know about the ships that made it home. But what about the ones that didn't? A ship could disappear into a storm and never return. A crew could vanish beyond the horizon. There was no emergency signal, no rescue operation, no final message explaining what happened. The ocean simply kept the failed version of the story. And that's why the successful voyages shouldn't make the Viking world look safe. They weren't safe. They were survivable. There's a huge difference. The Vikings didn't have one secret piece of technology that made freezing seas harmless. They had dozens of small advantages that worked together. Well, slowed heat loss. Dry clothing protected insulation. Food kept the body fueled. Shifts prevented exhaustion from taking over. The crew provided extra hands and some shared warmth. Shallow ships gave them more opportunities to reach land. Experience helped them recognize danger. And knowing when to turn around could save everyone. None of those things was enough by itself. But together, they bought something incredibly valuable. Time. Time to reach shore. Time to recover. Time to survive the storm. Time to keep your hands working. Time to keep your body functioning. And that's the real answer to how Vikings survived freezing seas. They didn't stay perfectly warm. They didn't become immune to the cold. They didn't simply overpower nature because they were tougher. They managed the cold. They protected what mattered. They used the resources they had. They worked together. They watched the weather. They saved energy when they could. They kept moving when they had to. And when the ocean became too dangerous, they tried to get out of it. So the next time you picture a Viking ship crossing the freezing North Atlantic, don't imagine some fearless warrior standing at the front, laughing at the storm. Picture a tired human pulling his cloak tighter. A sailor checking his hands. Someone protecting the last dry blanket. A crew member passing around food. Someone watching the clouds. Someone taking another person's shift. And a captain looking at the waves and deciding whether the ship should keep going. Because the real Viking achievement wasn't staying warm. It was staying alive long enough to make it home. And honestly, that might be a lot more impressive.